This is Aaron Good, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
And you've been busy. I've been watching a lot of your stuff. It was great. Thanks for John Kiriakou for setting us up so I could have you on the show. There's so much to discuss with you. First off, I love political scientists because you all are multidisciplinarians. You're part anthropologist, part sociologist. You guys look at a variety of different things. What would you say is your blend of disciplines within your political science sphere?
Well, I would say the best of political science does those things, but that is not really the zeitgeist of the discipline so much. I'm really an outlier. I try to, I'm influenced by sociologists like C. Wright Mills, especially, and I think in sort of anthropological sensibility, wherein you try to understand the different possibilities of and experiences and methods of doing things of different humans in different situations. I mean, that's kind of the heart of anthropology, is the study of all people in all places. I mean, in the bigger sense, it's what it
Right.
aspires to. And to an understanding of political economy, which I think is influenced by people like Michael Hudson and other critics of capitalism. I think I'm on the political left more so than most political scientists, but I don't really have much connection to the American left, which I think is not a very useful set
Mm.
of. It's dysfunctional and kind of co-opted in ways that it doesn't even know why it's so confused. So in a way, I'm a dissident in political science, and I'm kind of a dissident to the rest of to a lot of the left, such as it is in the U.S. And that has made me sort of an outsider. And I was somehow able to get a dissertation written and passed through a committee on the nature of the U.S. Empire and the oligarchy, the oligarchic forces that animate this system, which is, as I come to think about it more, is a lot of what political science and mainstream social science tries to obscure. So I don't know that I'm sure it wasn't a very good career move for me, but and that's
Yeah.
why most people don't do it. But I felt like it was important to look at these things in a scholarly, meticulous way. And I'm influenced by people like Lance DeHaven Smith and Peter Dale Scott
Mm.
and C. Wright Mills, as I said, or Michael Parenti, Michael Hudson, a number of thinkers that really informed my work and my approach to try to explain what I think needs explaining about this system, which is so effective at confusing people.
I was just reading a headline about the latest story, the iterations of all the stories about Area 51, and now it was all an information operation, with the colonel confessing, like, I was the one trying to confuse people to obfuscate what actually happened there. And look, I don't know if there's aliens or not, right? But it's always this next thing, this next thing, this next thing that confuses and confounds. And I'm a big believer of, I'm not a political scientist, but I'm choppy in that area. I'm a big believer that affect is greater than effect. So if I can get the emotional response to the stimuli that I create or that is around us, man, if I can do that well, I'm going to compete well for what I want to do. And ever since everything's a competition, affect is a really powerful tool. And like when we look at UFOs, I don't know what to believe. I can't invest myself in anything because everything can be true and everything can be false all at the same time. And
That's the
I think
beauty of our system. They can be lying about anything. And I feel like they're probably more likely than not trying to make us pay attention to UFOs when they're so we don't look at how badly they're bungling everything at the
yeah.
present.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, there's so much bungling that goes on. I know a lot of people because of my show, because of my past life, and you talk to a lot of people that really and truly believe, me included, that we've done well, like say, for example, in the wars, the modern wars. And the reality is we've done awful. All you got to do is scope back and you go, oh, what a mess. Oh no. Oh, we got this so wrong. And really nobody acts like they care. We might spend money and start an institution, that kind of thing, but are we changing anything? Are we putting the brakes on and saying, hey, we fuck people up here and abroad when we deploy somewhere? Let's not race into this. It's always more expensive than we think. It's we don't do that though. We don't act like we have principles to prevent us from screwing up.
No, and fundamentally we are in denial about the choice that we made at the end of World War II. I say we, but really
Mm-hmm.
an oligarchic. It was really economic elites, wealthy, politically active people that decided that the US would be the leader or the hegemon of global capitalism after World War II. And that if we were going to do this, we would need to have institutions like the UN that would allow us to present ourselves as lawful and somehow working with the international community. But in reality, we had this whole clandestine apparatus as well, not to mention the huge military machine, but this clandestine apparatus that would intervene to make sure that politics worked out the way we wanted it to.
Mm.
And as much as we talked about freedom and democracy, if a country elected a leader who wanted to nationalize their resource wealth and spend it on developing their own country, we would overthrow them. So it
Yeah.
wasn't about democracy. It was about a regime of property that was to be sacrosanct and protected above all else. So if the Shah wants to stop British Petroleum from screwing over his country and stealing all of its oil wealth, I'm sorry, the Shah, Mossadegh in Iran gets elected that way, the prime minister of Iran. Well, then the CIA just intervenes and installs the Shah as a dictator to make sure the oil money goes where it needs to go. And we could say, well, that was the Cold War and maybe they went a little too far. But then the Cold War ends and look at what we're doing to Venezuela today. What is Venezuela's sin? They nationalized their oil and they spent it on programs for poor people who were pretty damn poor. If you've ever seen like pictures of the favelas on the hillsides in Caracas, you're just like, damn, you wouldn't even guess that this was one of the most oil-rich countries in the world.
Sure.
But the wealth was being stolen. And now that we all see that our possibilities and our children's possibilities are kind of limited and so much is uncertain because of the world these people have created for us. It's not democratic. They break the law whenever they need to. And it's not even giving us good results. It is amazing that the Chinese have surpassed us in life expectancy. But that is because we have a regime and an oligarchy that is harmful to our interests. And I don't know how else to say it other than that. It's a predatory system that's predatory around the world and is increasingly hated for it, and is now understood increasingly in the US to be predatory and dangerous to our interests.
Yeah, boy, you could say that all again, and it would just still not be enough. We have some big problems. There's a lot of oil, turns out, off of the northern shore of South America. So Guyana is coming into a lot of money because it has a tremendous amount of oil wealth, and that creates ripples in the pool, right, in the money pool, and we don't like that. So what happens? Well, things outside of their control for sure. We'll send our people in, and good or bad outcomes really kind of doesn't really matter as long as we are making sure that the system maintains its power. And so a lot of this, to me, from my outside point of view, is focused on the exchange of power or the lack of exchanging power and saying, hey, this is where the power is going to reside. So Guyana, welcome to the party with oil, but here's how you're going to use it. And we hear this from American politicians when they talk about foreign policy. We'll make so-and-so do this. And they don't talk about a collaborative effort like, hey, this is great for country X because this will make them, whatever, more independent and whatever it's going to be. It's usually us putting our finger on them and telling them what they're going to do. And the State Department acts like that when I see them in the wild.
Right. And there were people who suggested other things for the U.S. They recommended it. Henry Wallace, who was Franklin Roosevelt's vice president,
Right.
he was saying things like, we have the technological ability to take care of all human needs in terms of shelter, clothing, transportation, education. We have those abilities already in the United States and in the West, and we could share our technology with the rest of the world so they could have all of these things too. And he was an anti-fascist, and he was the second most popular politician besides FDR himself. But in 1944, these oligarchs, one of them especially, their representative, a guy named Pauley, who was connected to Standard Oil, they stage a coup at the convention and they put in Harry Truman, who was a kind of a mobbed up guy from Missouri. The party was really corrupt. The Democratic Party was, and very mobbed up. And that was the guy that they put in. He gives Meyer Lansky the Medal of Freedom in 1945, for example, secretly. And he takes a huge campaign contribution from pro-Israel sources in 1948. And that's how he's able to upset Thomas Dewey and win that election. And he gets that presumably for recognizing Israel. And what you come away with is the idea that that I think the heart of our problem is the system
Mm.
itself, where we make it's like an article of faith that commerce and buying and selling of things is the most wonderful thing, and money and making money is just the most virtuous thing, as though the Bible, we basically turn the New Testament on its head. And I'm not saying this as a preacher or anything. I'm just saying, aware of our history and our cultural tradition as a supposedly Christian majority people, right? To aggrandize wealth which and power, which is so the opposite of what Jesus was saying, is very strange. We are a schizophrenic country that is a bit nuts, and we forget the people that were there. Like JFK is another one, besides Henry Wallace. People that said empire this empire is not the way to be. This Cold War, this empire is not that we should have international cooperation. And this was the way that ultimately American power and prestige would have been, maximalized. We could have shared technology with the rest of the world instead of trying to put them in debt peonage and overthrow their governments and steal their resources. And because we did not do that, we're finally at the point where someone is taking the international stage, and a group of countries, but especially China, is doing what the US should have done. When they
Mm.
say we want to have win-win economic relations, that's essentially what Wallace and the Kennedy brothers were saying. And our system just eliminated those guys. And that perspective is not even viable in our system anymore. Only sort of imperialism and people who think that we have the right to rule as much of the world as possible and have 1,000 military bases, or give or take, around the world, and dominate the global economy, but through the dollar. And
Yeah.
it's unrealistic. It's crumbling, but we don't even understand most of the people in the U.S. don't understand what the system was and how it got to be this way, and how we sowed our own destruction by being so greedy and imperialistic.
It is so hard to run this place because it's so complex and there's so much input to be nice about this. You're right. When you realize, like, you did a show sort of breaking down when Tucker Carlson interviewed Putin, right? And we all get mad about that. But then when you understand that there is a history here, there's a history, and our behavior isn't perfect, not even close to perfect. And then you take a look at the map at all the places where the U.S. military system is, and it's just don't circled in around Iran and Russia. And they get to be like, hey, man, back off. You said you weren't going to do this. You did it. You've got people in our country over here. These things matter, and they have a legacy. We tend to not pay attention to this stuff, but those guys get to. They get to say, hey, you're not making this a level playing field. Does that make Putin a saint? No. But there is a lot of bad behavior. You mentioned Iran and how we brought the Shah in and all that. We have not behaved well as a partner for Iran either. They get to be pissed at us.
Yeah, for good reason. And this is now at the point where America as an empire acted like a kind of lawless bully who was always putting a halo on himself as the
Right.
defender of freedom and the free world and so on. But in the 21st century, especially since 9/11 and the response to it, which was really, a bizarre thing, because you have these people writing their crazy agenda, the Project for a New American Century, and how they wanted full spectrum dominance, and the U.S. needed to be in control of they need to control all economic matters and outer space. They want to militarize that, and they want to have bioweapons. It's the most lunatic manifesto, and they needed to get rid of Saddam Hussein. That was one of them, and it's really written by these super pro-Israel neoconservative fanatics. And it would have just seemed like, oh boy, somebody put something in the crack that they've been smoking, because they're even crazier than normal. But then 9/11 comes along, and it's like this perfect spectacle for exactly the crime spree, international crime spree that they wanted to go on, not to mention the surveillance state and everything else like at home. But the result is that we go on these wars that are destroying that have destroyed the U.S. position in the world. The Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Arab Spring Wars in Libya and Syria. Which, I mean, we were so determined to put ISIS in Syria, which I knew at the time. I was saying I was in political science, and I was the only one of my peers in that program saying this is bullshit. It's the U.S. it's a U.S. regime change operation, just like they always do, because that was my focus at the time. So I knew what Libya and Syria were about, but I may as well, I was just, shouting into the abyss there. But
Yeah.
these things, as the U.S. has become more just gangster and just having to deny what they're doing, it's coincided with a decrease in power. And we actually can't we can't determine the outcomes just by force anymore. In fact, the balance of force is not in our favor, as we're seeing in Ukraine. It's a disaster for the U.S. empire, and it was such a stupid miscalculation. And by the actions of the U.S., I think they've essentially vindicated Putin, because the way that we have stuck with this idea that we were going to weaken Russia by using Ukraine this way, we have stuck with it to the bitter end, to where if anybody said Putin wasn't really threatened, he overreacted. Like, it's so clear that
Mhm.
everything we were doing in Ukraine was to damage Russian national security, to essentially affect the strategic defeat of Russia, if possible. And
Yeah.
so the U.S. has just shown itself to be an outlaw nation, and I think the rest of the world is really sick of this, and is hoping so that we don't have to see things like the Ukraine war and the Gaza genocide and so on. But are we going to be able to? Is Trump going to take the reins here and like end this, even for his own ego, or is he going to preside over worse and worse disasters? Because it doesn't seem that you can just things cannot go on the way that they have.
Yeah.
The regime is going to have to make some decisions, and there's a lot of cause for pessimism and worry about what this regime is going to do, because all indications are that it is run by predatory, malignant forces.
Mm. Yeah, it's really uncomfortable to have this conversation. This is like, flies in the face of what we believe and what we hear about ourselves and everything. But there's so much of this that is true, and even if it's competing truths, we do export problems. We often bring a packaged solution that solves that problem when you get there, and it's usually like change your culture. And these things are very random and hard to control. And I always talk about, can you reliably and repeatedly do the thing that you want to do to affect the end that you want? And the fact is we don't even train to do that. And I'm talking on the military and the State Department side. So we do have these grand ideas that I always say they brief well. Oh, they briefs well. Boy, that sounds really good. We ought to do that. In US,
PowerPoint on it, right?
right? Yeah, USAID, all the NGOs they support, State Department. You have this mishmash. Forget the money laundering part of the NGOs. Just the idea that you can go to a foreign country and teach women about their hygiene, like they don't have the period already there. And of course, they have menstrual cycles. Of course, they have a way of dealing with it. Is it state of the art? I don't know. But neither of the people going there trying to teach people about this. Like, this is how, and then now you have women going into another woman's home without talking to the man who's trying to keep that family safe. And here's what result is we don't study here's the anthropology side. We don't care to even study what the impact is of us messing with how they deal with a female's menstrual cycle.
Yeah, there's
And
weird stuff that they
insane.
have gotten into over the whole idea that we were in Afghanistan to like save women,
Yeah.
when like that was preposterous. My working theory on Afghanistan, the reason we stayed there for so long, is that it was to have a monopoly on opium production.
Sure. Yeah. Drugs. Yeah.
Because otherwise it kind of doesn't make it. And then they leave, and there's we're gonna leave. But you heard these statements from people. Oh, we'll be there for 50 years, and like and it's not just drugs, but to have the drug monopoly situated there in between in between Iran, China, and
Mhm.
Russia, because that's where Afghanistan is. It's very strategic in that way. It was some kind of pipe dream that they had to resist the tide of history, which is power returning to the
Yeah.
East, and Eurasia and Eurasian integration as a major part of this area that has never really been developed, never been connected with rail and telecommunications and so on. The prospect of China doing this, which it's doing, China, Russia, and Iran, and all of their partners, this is changing history. And it's in the Chinese national interest to basically act as good guys. The more that
Yeah.
they can have positive relations with other countries and allow these poorer countries to develop and to show that their model is better, the more it hurts the U.S., but it also has the impact of raising living standards in China and in these countries that the U.S. and the West has treated as backwaters or
Mm.
sort of imperial pawns on the chessboard or spaces on the chessboard. And I think that what's going to happen to the U.S. if we don't have some terrible nuclear confrontation, which is quite possible, is the most optimistic scenario is that we will just be transcended as a system, that this other system will be able to take advantage of human potential and technology and harness it in a way, because they're not trying simply to just make a class of rich people super rich forever, which is really what
Mhm.
the U.S. and the West is. That it's in their interest to create a system based on observance of international law and win-win economic relations. I see that as being actually in the interests of the Chinese and these other countries' leaders, and
Yeah.
that the U.S. is just going to increasingly seem like this danger to the world that's making everybody trade in their dollars and sanctioning everybody and threatening to bomb them,
Oh my gosh. So many
slaughtering
things.
thousands of
Yeah.
children. I mean, the things that we're doing now and that are kind of you can't really hide in the internet age. Like, as much as they try to boost things and deboost things algorithmically, the rest of the world is waking up. And even Americans, even though our critique is not unified, the consensus that this is a corrupt and deeply flawed and messed up system is pretty universal now.
Yeah. If Pete was president, and he's not going to be, so nobody has to worry, but I would go to my chairman of the Joint Chiefs and say, bring your units to attention and do an accountability for me. You have 10 minutes, because there's no way they can give them 10 days, you can give them 10 months. They can't even count how many people they have. They don't know where
Yeah, they
everybody
can't
is.
pass an audit.
Right. And so a lieutenant would have to bring your people to attention, tell them where everybody is. It's a call. Okay, great. Vacation, great. 1A, well, great. But we can account for everybody. Somewhere above the brigade level, they lose control of that stuff. Maybe even at the brigade level, they start to lose people. This includes contracted support and everything else. So when the president, I think President Trump was the last guy to try to do it. He's like, hey, tell me where everybody is and how many people we got. Well, and then the next words out of your mouth, if you're the boss, is you're relieved. But they don't do that. Those guys stay in power. They get sweet gigs afterwards. Look, I don't think that, I don't know that Pete Hegseth is the right guy to be SecDef, but he is. And he gets his chance to do it because the boss is the boss and he's now the boss of the military. But I don't know that anybody before him did a good job. And those guys all get cakey jobs afterwards. They continue to stay wealthy. And so they're just oriented upwards on how do I maintain this status of living and get higher status. And that doesn't benefit our ability to go out and do our jobs well. I'll shut up here in a second. The military is desperate to have this fight that we know how to win. Tanks, helicopters, ships, all these things. They're desperate for that fight. But the fight that is brought to us is never that fight. It's small. It's hard to figure out. It takes a lot of training and a lot of things that aren't killing people. And we suck at it. And since we suck at it, we're just going to focus on the big shit and go park aircraft carriers off the coasts. That is a viable way to deter things. It's also
Except
a viable
it's not
way
anymore.
to...
It's not anymore.
Yeah,
They just got beat by Yemen. The poorest country on earth just defeated the U.S. military.
Right.
I mean,
That's
this
right.
is, and Iran is the same way. I think Iran doesn't want to get nuked because you don't want to see millions of your people die, but they
Right.
have a defense network of ballistic missile installations around the country, sophisticated air defense, augmented by Russian systems as well,
Right.
the extent of which we probably don't even know. I think that they are trying to do everything to avoid an attack because it would be bad for them, but I think it would be a catastrophe for the U.S. if they do. And I think that the balance there is so vast that even the U.S. military has some people who are realists. And as I understand it, they've wargamed scenarios with Iran and the U.S. always loses. Iran has only gotten considerably stronger in the last few years because
Right.
of panic and about it. And also I think that the Chinese and Russians have such an interest in making sure that Iran is not toppled that they've lent their power to them in different ways.
Right.
So we can't fight with Iran. It would be a disaster. The best we can do is destroy each other in all three of these areas: Iran, China, and Russia. And so, if we were sensible, we would take a step back and start to defer more to try to adhere to international law and say to other countries, let's all adhere
What?
to international law.
Yeah.
Which is,
Yeah,
but
boy,
the fact that that's unthinkable should tell us so much. Like, who is it
yeah.
that would refuse to ever adhere to the law? The only person is a gangster.
got to have that rule of law until it doesn't suit us. Yeah, it's there's so much to talk about in this area. I wanted to go back real quick to Iran. People don't realize quite often that Moscow and Tehran are just not that far away. It's not a day drive, but it's not a 5 day drive. And you just drive there. And so when we are desperate to topple Russia or to wobble it substantially, you're talking about a place with a lot of nuclear weapons. And the closer you get to toppling that, the less control you have over these things. And we're worried about a nuclear Iran. They can just acquire a nuclear weapon. It would move, and we would be very fortunate to have even a whiff of that. And it doesn't matter anyhow.
Yeah,
they have the capability, just if not now, in weeks. They have the capability. And then what are we going to do about it? Let Israel go whack them? Maybe that's the plan. Maybe that is. But it's
so
not a very
small.
good plan.
Israel can be. I think Iran could flatten much of Israel just with its conventional arsenal. That's my understanding. That they have these hypersonic missiles. They already showed that they could overwhelm their defense systems. They've been extremely judicious in responding to Israel. The way that they sent all those missiles and they warned them about it, and they overwhelmed the system, but they did it in such a way as to only destroy a small amount. And you know that was on purpose. They didn't want to provoke the attack, but they wanted to restore deterrence, and they did. And that is a remarkable thing because they've only gotten stronger since then. There's been all these planes flying in and out from Russia of different air defense systems. When the Israelis tried to retaliate, they didn't even get within 100 miles of their border, and they turned around. It is a changing world.
It's a changing world.
And just as the truth of American weakness militarily is being exposed, and for Israel also, really, we are doing the worst things for our image. I mean, the slaughter, the wanton slaughter of thousands of children is it's not something that we have seen. Even with Iraq, the conflict was so diffuse and chaotic, and it wasn't concentrated on this one tiny area of a defenseless population. It didn't, the internet wasn't at the same stage that it is today. Also, that must be another factor. But I think that the world is just, not only is American power waning in the hard military sense, like just losing a war to Yemen essentially, but our moral legitimacy or our ability to even make a effective PR message for ourselves is just vanishing. And instead, there's these horrible images of like babies being dug out of rubble, or a Palestinian holding a headless corpse, surrounded by like fire and rubble, and he's screaming at the heavens, and you can relate to him because it's a horrific thing seeing a decapitated toddler or baby. And it's like, and they're just saying, no, you're not doing that. If you think that you're an anti-Semite, it's the whole world is horrified at this, except for people who are just brainwashed.
Yeah. And yet we also have people racing out to be the first one to wave their anti-Semite flag.
Well, that's they get paid to do that. I mean, it's a lucrative industry, but I don't think anybody even, the joke of it is that increasingly people don't care. It's more of like, if you're not being called an anti-Semite, you're probably doing something wrong these days, which is, that was never the case before, but I think it is now. Now it's just people look at the ADL and these people increasingly, and it's just, it hasn't translated into the way the media and the top reports on things because of power, but it's starting to. You're starting to even see journalists say, I mean, people like Piers Morgan, who I feel is a, not very respectable character, but even just to cover his own ass, perhaps, he feels like he has to speak out against the wanton slaughter of children.
Yeah, the Israel-Palestine question it appears unsolvable. Like there's no solution to be made where both parties are like, we figured it out. Like we did it probably with the Irish, and sort of got that chilled out after a long time. It doesn't appear to be possible. So whatever the outcome is going to be now, 20 years from now, whatever it's going to be, it's not going to be gentle. And it's not gentle now. It hasn't been gentle in the last 30 years. There's been some hots and colds, but we don't pay attention to this here in the United States. But they count wars, and they've got dozens and dozens of wars. And Iran openly challenges Israel's existence too. So, and they fund all this violence. We have a problem. I'm putting both sides together here, where we have two people that cannot exist in the same region.
Yeah, but one of them is a group of white people from Eastern Europe.
Yeah, yeah, but it's
Like,
also a
so
nation.
it's like, and
Yeah,
who, yeah, I mean, it's an ersatz nation. I mean, this, a lot of, at the time that Zionism began, there was serious opposition from major Jewish organizations, people, and major Jewish thinkers, like Albert Einstein, Hannah Arendt,
right.
who were saying that these people are basically fascists. And I
Yeah,
think that that was correct, but because of the connections to power across the Western world, they were able to secure this colony essentially. And it's bizarre because these are typically, I know that there's a different, the population's a little bit different now, but the founding members, these were all Eastern Europeans with I mean, the family name of Netanyahu is like really Milikowski.
hmm,
These are, so, and they've come in, and they never wanted, they never declared what their borders were because they always wanted greater, so-called greater Israel. They've done everything to avoid the creation of a Palestinian state, even though that was U.S. policy for a long time. And we now see why they never wanted it. And this, what I think we're seeing now, is the final solution. Like they never wanted to allow a Palestinian state to exist, but the politics in the U.S. and around the world made it such that they couldn't just kill them, and they think they can do it now. They think
yeah,
they can just murder everyone and or force the other people to leave so they can take over the country or that territory, and that's why it's hard to get along with somebody who does that in your area. I mean, this
yeah,
is a,
yeah. Yeah, well,
and I
and
think more
Israel's
people
not
see it this
innocent,
way
right?
now.
Yeah. Yeah, Israel's not innocent in the way they've behaved. And the Palestinians are not innocent. The region is not innocent. It is, I mean, I'll go back to this position. It is unsolvable. We can try to figure out who was there first or who that land belongs to. It's unknowable. It's unknowable because we can't go back far enough. We can't decide things.
The
It,
UN
yeah,
resolution said there was supposed to be a Palestinian homeland carved
right.
out of that, and that's been the official U.S. position. But whenever any president, even Reagan and H.W. Bush, if you go back and look at it, they were the last two to stand up to the Israel lobby. And H.W. Bush, I know from, I mean, I kind of deduced this already, but it
Mm,
was interesting that in talking to this guy named Gary Vogler, who wrote these two books on Iraq and oil, and he served in the oil ministry in Iraq. He was the longest serving civilian person in the occupation of Iraq. He was there for a long time, and he realized that that war had been fought for Israel, and that they had people like Doug Feith were going against the president's wishes. They were attempting to restore the Haifa pipeline so that Israel would essentially have all of Iraq's oil running, be the broker of Iraqi oil essentially out to the Mediterranean Sea. And that they also believe, Vogler believes, after talking to people close to the Bush family, because he was an oil executive who knew people even higher up than him in the world of big oil. H.W. Bush believed the reason he lost in 92 was because he tried to compel Israel to accept a Palestinian state, and that W. Bush wanted to correct his father's mistake, and therefore he allowed Israel basically free reign over much of his foreign policy. And that is why he did all of those things with like the Iraq war and
right.
so on. That this was really his way of trying to get a second term, and he gets a second term. So
Yeah.
this is something we have to grapple with: is the power of the Israel of Zionism in this neoconservative uh, faction that took over U.S. foreign policy. And
Yeah.
it's because Gaza is not the most strategic position in the world for U.S. interests, such that it would be useful for American geopolitical purposes. This is actually more causing the U.S. much more harm. All of these wars in the Middle East and now the genocide. This is something that is bad about our system. That organized money can can win the day. And if anything, it's so it goes beyond Zionism in Israel, even though I
Right.
think that they are pretty horrible actors historically and at the present. But the bigger issue is this system where money and organized money and imperialism override democracy and the law all the time. And they control the media to the point that you even had a dedicated Zionist, Norm Coleman, recently saying, I don't know if you saw this, but he was saying, he's this Jewish Zionist ex-senator, and he was speaking at some sort of APAC conference or something like that. And he said, what's going on social media? They're saying so many bad things about this terrible anti-Semitism, but we own the social media companies. We are the masters of the universe, Zuckerberg and blah, blah, blah. And he's basically, if you were saying that, oh, Zionists or Jews, either way, they control social media and they're the masters of the universe, they would say, oh, you're an anti-Semite, you are,
Yeah.
a Nazi or something. But this was an advocate for it, and he's a
Mm.
former senator, and that's the kind of system that we have. It's this oligarchic system, and it lends itself to imperialism and greed and profiteering at the expense of democracy or the rule of law, not to mention morality and just, humanity.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, pulling back from the Israel and Hamas conflict, because again, Pete thinks that's unknowable. You have your opinion and just stated it. I think that we're not going that far apart on that, even though we disagree in some areas. What we do agree is that the money controls so much of these things. Where you look at our foreign policy when it comes to Ukraine, and we just kind of pick a line. Anybody on this side, I always talk about a chalk line we snap. Anybody on this side, good. Anybody on this side, let them move any money internationally. They'll be on the bad side with us because we can gin up some kind of legal offense, and we can take these business people who will call oligarchs there. We don't call our oligarchs.
Even
We
though
don't
they're
get
way
mad.
richer.
Right, yeah, and we'll get mad at those guys because they're Russians, right? And that's our boogeyman. And so they do these things that undermine things. Going back to an earlier thing that you said, where we have rules, international rules that we're supposed to abide. There's law. There's a rule of law that we don't like to abide when it's inconvenient for us. We're not supposed to fuck with other people's elections. We certainly don't like it happening to us, and yet we know openly. We make movies about how we've done this thing. By the way, and this is just for everybody else, I'm sure you know this. Well over 10 years ago, we decided that space was not for war. We're like the first one to race up there and go, here's how we're going to do war up here. We decided it was not going to belong to anybody. It was going to be this, humanity space. And so there's international law that's agreed upon that we're not going to do war type activities up there. And we just cannot abide that. We will not do it. We want to dominate all of it. We want to be first. And this is the negative part of the capitalism, the competition, is that we can get up there faster. We can set everything up to our liking. And if you don't like it, then we're going to launch a missile at your wedding. Oops,
Right.
sorry, we didn't mean that. No, sorry, not a wedding. Oh no.
Well, let me get to the heart of this issue of the law. The U.S. Constitution, which you have the Federalist Society and other people who supposedly we're the originalists and we stick to the letter of the law.
Right.
Well, this is all nonsense. It always ends up being just a way to excuse deference to power when it suits you. But if it doesn't, then you just ignore it, because notice how much they violate the First Amendment and everything else. And these right-wing judges defend the national security state whenever it does these things. But on a more fundamental level, the U.S. has the Constitution has the supremacy clause, which says that ratified treaties are the supreme law of the land. And the UN Charter is a ratified treaty, a treaty ratified by the U.S. Senate and signed into law, and thus it is the supreme law of the land. And the UN Charter stipulates that international aggression is illegal and that military interventions and such are illegal unless there is the approval of the Security Council.
Mm.
So all of these times that we overthrow a government covertly, because aggression and even the threat of aggression are outlawed by the UN Charter, which is the supreme law of the land in the U.S., according to the U.S. Constitution.
Right.
But we overthrow governments, we invade them, we bomb them without UN security approval. We violate our own Constitution all the time. So there really isn't any rule of law in the U.S. In terms of any statute or even the Constitution that can't be overridden simply with reference to national security concerns. I mean, if you can violate that so brazenly, and you're doing it constantly, the U.S. is violating the Constitution in that way, in innumerable ways, with operations that we're doing covertly or overtly around the world, and there is no force that can hold them to account, because essentially we are an empire, and empires operate on the basis which was articulated by the Athenian in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, when he went to the island of Melos and said, you are talking about right and wrong here, but that only matters. That's only a question among equals in power. When you have people who are unequal in power, the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. And that is essentially the credo of empires and of the U.S. empire. And this cannot but also contain within it the seeds of destruction for every empire. And every empire falls because empire is unsustainable. It generates the forces that will bring it down because people oppose imperialism, fundamentally don't want to be dominated by a faraway force. And so predictably, this has happened to the U.S., but we think we're exceptional and special. And so these ironclad rules of history don't apply to us because we're the city on the hill and we're the shining example for freedom. But if you look at these leaders that we've had, Trump, and then sandwiched between two Trump terms, this senile dotard who presided over disasters in Ukraine and Israel. I mean, this is not a shining city on the hill. This is a shit show.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no Trump person, and I would rather someone more professional was there, right? But yeah, when the best candidate the other side can put forward is this person who's clearly demented before he won the election, and then we hide him, and then we lie about it, and it's hard to take any of them seriously. And who are they going to help? Are they really going to help the little guy? I don't know. And look, that's the little guy complaining about stuff, but it's challenging.
Little guy at this point is like 80% of the population.
Yeah, it's challenging, right? Like, we have a system where we talk about democracy, and it's very difficult to prove that we've got it. We mess with districting in a way that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We mess with judges in a way that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so I don't know that if you took a vote and just left everything alone, that you'd have. I mean, look, whoever loses, the other side's like, we was robbed every single time, because we just have a waning confidence in our elections.
On purpose, though. On purpose, yeah. They have intentionally made these elections. I mean, they stopped releasing exit poll data, which is the way we used to detect fraud in foreign elections. We would say, the exit polls are off. Around 2004, they varied widely from what was what the reported outcome was, and there are many indications that election was stolen, and that it probably should have been John Kerry who won. Not that I'm a big John Kerry fan at all at this point, but he even thought that. I know he privately admitted this to people like Mark Miller and Greg Palast, I believe, too, that different things about it. I don't know about Palast because he's a little dodgy, but I know that Mark Miller talked to him about this, and he gave him his book, and he talked about the 2004 election. But since then, they stopped publishing the raw exit poll data, which they adjust the exit polls after the fact so that they match what was reported at the polls. A lot of it is ballots that are counted by machines, or where there's no paper record whatsoever. Right. The only reason that you have a system that is so opaque like this, and that could not really be audited in a reliable way, the only reason you would want that kind of electoral system is so that you would preserve the ability to steal elections. And it's so funny that the Democrats became the party that said, if you question an election result, that's like treason, and you should never do that. Like, that's you're being anti-democracy if you do that. And they wanted to censor people for doing that. I mean, that just shows how corrupt this system is, because they want to keep this system that is so vulnerable to fraud in place, and they won't let it be reformed. And the obvious inference is, well, they want it to be vulnerable to outright fraud and theft, because why would they want us to elect somebody they don't like? I mean, they killed President Kennedy, who was the most popular president in the post-war era since they started taking Gallup poll ratings. So these are people that don't believe in democracy at all. They believe in the opposite of democracy.
It's I hate that I agree with you so much, but folks that shouldn't be trusted act like that, right? And so when you do things, again, right or left, I don't think it matters in this case. When you do things that aren't trustworthy, then we shouldn't trust you. And so, I guess let's talk a little bit about the Kennedy stuff. You've been through the papers. You've been on other shows talking about it. The question I have is, we have this Warren report that went to all the trouble and all the subsequent reports that the government put together, and we never end up in a clear space. It's always this. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. This conspiracy that it involves people from Lithuania or whatever it is, right? So, what is do you think the story? What is the best answer? What is the least common denominator, like all reduced down? So we think it was probably this group that did it.
I believe that it was a faction within the CIA tied to organized crime and tied to Zionism in partnership with the military brass and the people that were running the Joint Chiefs and had control of the nation's emergency communications network, the Doomsday Network,
Mm-hmm.
and etc. And I'm sure there were many oligarchs in the U.S. that were against this, against what Kennedy was doing, because Kennedy sought to end the Cold War. He had a policy. He ran for president in order to stop, because he was horrified at the prospect of nuclear war. And he wanted to make sure that that did not happen. But he had to adapt to a kind of and accommodate a pretty insane Cold War system that was imperialistic, but pretended that it was really a defense of freedom. You couldn't really, in that position, call the U.S. out for truthfully for being as bad as it was, because it was just not something that the American political system was ready to accept. So he did this in different ways. He organized he managed to pass a partial nuclear test ban treaty with Russia. But the last speech that he gave to the UN was about the US and the Soviet Union jointly exploring space together, sharing technology and so on. And he gave his peace speech in the summer of 1963, where he said, we cannot rely, we don't want to create a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, that the reality of war in this age is too unthinkable, and that we need to find a way to exist peacefully.
Right.
Even if we're going to disagree, let it be a peaceful disagreement, and let's compete peacefully, and so that we do not have a nuclear war, and that the U.S. is not here trying to dominate the world by weapons of war. And that was so threatening, because the Cold War was really the oligarchs' perfect system, because if you are in favor, if you're against private property and private wealth and private for-profit corporations, then you're just the enemy. You are the enemy of not just these corporate oligarchs, because it's hard to sell that to the American people, to say,
Right.
John, these people are dangerous to the interests of David Rockefeller. Isn't that so sad? But that was the reality of it. But instead they say you're a danger to the American way, to all of our freedoms, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But really the issue is a class of oligarchic wealth that was able to go and take over much of the world and dominate it economically with this dollarized economy and this war machine. And they became the wealthiest class of oligarchs in human history, in part because of this imperial enterprise. And Kennedy went after that. And they were going after the National Crime Syndicate, which is really an international crime syndicate.
Right.
And Bobby did not understand completely what he was dealing with there, but he was closer to it than these other people. It took Hoover a while, and the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics a while, to even admit that there was a national crime syndicate. And I think that because they had been protecting people, especially Lansky, in this endeavor, they sort of scapegoated the Italian mafia. But in reality, this is a multi-ethnic thing, and the Lansky Teamster nexus seems to be more powerful. Las Vegas, yeah. Lansky, and the Teamsters are more powerful than the Italian mafia. That's why look who gets killed when they're investigating these things in the mid-70s. Okay, not Trafficante, but he gets indicted later in the in the mid-80s. That's an interesting case. But Sam Giancana gets killed while he had been sort of under government, like the police had been watching him and so on. And I believe that his security evaporates, and somebody who he knew came in and killed him. Johnny Rosselli ends up chopped up in a barrel. Jimmy Hoffa gets killed. John Martino, who's another mafia guy, gets killed. I mean, but Lansky lives to be, he goes to Israel during Watergate, for example. He's untouched during the Kennedy assassination, the mid-70s era, except once he comes back from Israel, we've never really grappled with what RFK was doing and what the Teamsters were doing. Even if you watch The Irishman today, it asks this question about, or it sort of poses it just by way of reiterating the point. Everybody knew who Jimmy Hoffa was, and look at this crazy web of corruption that was such an important part of American life. And Nixon releases him from prison, and Bobby Kennedy's trying to get him to throw him into prison. And somehow we've forgotten about all this, and we never really had any satisfactory explanation. And isn't it strange that Jack Ruby had all these ties to like the Las Vegas mob and, people like Mickey Cohen, who were so close to Lansky, and Trafficante's underlings like Louis McWillie. And Trafficante was a subordinate of Meyer Lansky. And, Jack Ruby is one of the most absurdly mobbed up characters if you look at his history, and they knew a lot about him. He'd been an informant and involved in all these high-level drug cases, and they just pretend it didn't happen.
Yeah.
So the Kennedy assassination is all of these dark forces that collectively we could call the deep state. And I don't believe that RFK and JFK totally understood everything that they were grappling with. But the truth is they were much more connected. The National Crime Syndicate, the military-industrial complex, the oligarchs who run the U.S. This is a kind of fascistic empire that's covertly run. It's like, because we just pretend it's not, that it doesn't work this way. So we don't have like this Nazi state saying we want the Lebensraum, we believe in the Führer principle, and whatever they do to protect the state is good. We pretend to be lawful and democratic, but we have this dark force that we can call the deep state that is more powerful than democracy in the United States. And if you want to be blunt about it, I believe you're not that far off the mark to say that the deep state is just capitalism, that you cannot, with a capitalist political economy where you have so much money up for grabs depending on who owns what, that it cannot but turn into a kind of a ruthless Game of Thrones type of thing domestically, but also internationally. Domestically with these crimes like the Kennedy assassination and so on, and then internationally just through imperialism. And that is having your whole society organized around greed and the acquisition of wealth and power. This is the kind of fundamental sickness of our system, and it's increasingly morbid at this point.
Well, that sounds terrible. All that stuff.
That is why it is terrible, but at least it helps us to understand it, because I believe that it is crumbling now. And the Kennedy assassination, it's not so much about JFK as this white hat, but he was a reformer. I believe he was sincere about wanting to reform things, but he also had to accommodate this system. So he was both functionally an imperialist in some ways with his policies to try to balance things, but he was an imperialist, we could say, who was killed for being an anti-imperialist.
Right.
And that that reflects, I think, the insanity of this system, and then covered up in a very unpersuasive way, but just with the power of the state behind it, so nobody can do anything about it. But the reality of it is, it's obvious really who killed JFK in the bigger sense. The regime killed JFK. But we don't know what kind of regime we have. In political science term, the regime means all of those institutions and arrangements which determine who has access to control of the state. And we think we live in a democratic regime, but if the head of state can be eliminated in broad daylight, shot in the head in the middle of the street, high noon in Texas, and nobody can do anything about it, then we have a different regime than we thought we had. And that was the mystery, in a sense, that I was trying to set out to solve with my political science dissertation.
Yeah. By the way, everybody, you can get Aaron's book. It's right here. Look in the link down there. One of the things that's troubling about all this is like, you look at something as dramatic as the JFK assassination and all of the things that happened subsequent, the mysterious deaths, and maybe they're all innocent, right? But all of them, like one guy dies from a karate chop. Yeah, it all just seems, and that's a fact, that actually happens. Yeah. The way that some of the people are like, I handed in some tape and never heard anything else back. Like, this is a president that got assassinated. You don't just lose evidence at the rate that it was. Maybe you do. I don't know. It seems impossible to me that that's true. And so there's all these problems with these cases. And now we have this Butler PA attempt, and we know fuck all about this person or what happened or why it happened or anything. And And then we may never know anything. And how many of these things just get kind of black holed and we just don't ever hear anything about them? It makes, let me just back up and talk about what I know about. Okay. I was a spy, I was a counterintelligence agent in the Army. So I know about intelligence. And I know that DC is full of agents trying to recruit people to do things for the benefit of their side, their nation, whatever it is. And when we don't put people in jail for protecting classified information, Americans, well, then that means that guys like me know how to go out and get information because these folks won't be held to account. And I don't care which side it is, what party it is. If there's one on one side, there's 10 on the other, and there's 10 back on that side. But we don't do the accounting for that. We just act like, hey, it's no big deal. Classified was spilled. No big deal. Nobody got harmed. Everything's good. We're all moving on to the next thing. And so we don't have a state that seems to want to be taken seriously. It's very emotional. It's very finger pointy, but it doesn't seem to want to be above reproach. Maybe politics can't be above reproach, but when you talk about these things, they all kind of go together for me, where like we should have a healthy mistrust, as a democracy. We should look at the system and say, are we getting what we're supposed to be getting out of this? And then who on earth could we elect to change these things? It's not a representative. It's not a senator. And it's probably not a president. And by the way, one more thing, little rant here. But the president has become more and more of a monarch. I mean, we see President Trump acting more and more like a monarch and saying, take me to court, figure out if I'm actually the top cop, if I'm a top prosecutor, if I'm the top whatever, I get to say these things. And he's codifying in through law all of these things that I don't think we ever intended for the president to have total power over.
No, but it's the president on the surface seems to be an imperial presidency, and yet he only really has that power in recent decades if he is going with the general thrust of the oligarchy of the empire. I mean, so the president seems to have this authority, and he has the nominal authority to, authorize all of these crazy things like CIA torture programs, extraordinary rendition, wireless wiretapping, social media manipulation, all these things. But does the president have the power to not do those things? Does the president have the power to hold accountable previous administrations? Because if you recall, there were discussions about going after Bush for torture and for Iraq war intelligence. This was under Obama, and Obama said, no, I feared doing that. I told people we couldn't do this because there might be a military coup. So if Obama was saying that, that should have raised more alarm bells that this appeared in the press that this happened, but we just sort of shrug it off. So is the president
and he became
really
the
powerful?
red kill button pushing dude that he was too, which was totally like a total transformation. He went back to the system. At least we're going to give this kind of benefit of the doubt. The system was so strong, it changed who he was to being a torturer and to being a robot button killer.
Or he was a guy who made it to where he was because he was known to accommodate power. And then when he encountered that power, if he didn't totally understand things going in, which I'm agnostic about that, I think he's a much more shallow thinker than anybody wants to acknowledge because he's pretty well spoken. But he is such an establishment person to the core, and his mother's involvement with U.S. aid and such in Indonesia, the family is much spookier than people realize. And I think that he grew up, with being adjacent to these sort of deep state forces. His mother was an anthropologist, and his one of his stepfathers was a colonel in the Indonesian military who went back there in the mid 60s when they were carrying out these horrific slaughters of the population, in large part after a CIA instigated coup to secure the dominance of Suharto and to allow for Western multinationals to have access to, or to control really, the Southeast Asia's, the world's biggest gold reserves that were mind-blowing at the Freeport-McMoran mine now. Freeport Sulfur back in the day is what it was called, and also enormous oil deposits. And so that just fell into the U.S. lap. And one of the things they did was send anthropologists into West Papua, like Obama's mom, working for USAID, to sort of ethnographically map these different tribes and peoples just for purposes of counterinsurgency and suppression of the population and so on, this is some very nefarious and sinister things. And then his mom is depicted as this sort of hippie, woman, this international traveler and anthropologist and so on. And that was just not the case. So these are the kind of people that we get, like people who are so fraudulent to the core and such holograms of themselves that we are left to wonder, like, exactly how sinister are they? Did they want to do anything better? And I worked for Obama. I mean, you have a career or background in military intelligence, but my mother worked for a Democratic congressman. I worked on the Obama campaign. I worked on in the 04 election campaign. We were low level because I was, not as motivated maybe as I could have been. But that's what I was doing, working in politics. And it is just so dirty and corrupt that I feel like I was pretty far to the left, especially on foreign policy. But this illusion of politics in the U.S., when everything is really beyond it, it's not so much that it's not really left right. It's that it's actually the left in the U.S. is often kind of annoying and sanctimonious on these cultural issues. They have contempt for the working class. They can be called elitist fairly and accurately. And so people are contemptuous of the left. But the actual more serious left critique of imperialism and capitalism, I think, is pretty self-evident now. It's just we forget that that's actually what the left should be. So we have two right-wing parties, but then one of them is real on cultural issues, sometimes aggressively left-wing, if you can call it left-wing.
Right.
Because if you're not going to touch the empire and you're not going to touch the financial system of corporate power, if you're not going to touch the economy or the empire, then all you have are cultural issues. So it's like abortion, gay rights, trans rights, and then taking positions on these until you found something that's like really divisive, and then the population will argue about forever. So gay marriage is kind of receded because it's not even really an issue anymore.
Right.
But these other hot button issues, the Democrats want to associate themselves with, and liberals do. And it's kind of an apolitical politics because it doesn't, whatever our position is on, trans athletes biological males playing girls sports, this does not affect Goldman Sachs or Boeing, Lockheed at all. We could kill each other over this and they'd be happy about it. And I'm not arguing for like the conservative cultural position or not. I tend to be more on what you would think of as left cultural things, but I don't even think that's politics. That's like, these are cultural issues. When you live in a regime that is lawless, murderous, exploitative, and doesn't deny people the basics of like the ability to get a good education, housing, and healthcare, even though we have the technology to do that, then you don't really live in a democracy. You live under kind of a despotic regime. And that's really the only political issue at the time that really matters. These other things how do you have politics when you don't have any power and you're ruled by a lawless oligarchy bent on world domination, and you're going to be arguing over, these cultural issues?
Yeah.
But that makes the left so useless in America.
It's insane. And then to export that stuff to other places. If you were going to be in charge, whatever in charge means, and you want to distract the populace, I couldn't think of a more insignificant topic in terms of world scope and history and everything else than trans athletes. I mean, you're talking about 0.010% of the population.
Yeah, right.
And we're gonna have all this conversation about it. I'm not hard on either side. I want people to be people and people to be happy and healthy, but that can't be where our attention is when we have these global conflicts that have our fingerprints all over it, and like you said, we didn't do so good in Yemen. We haven't done so great in Ukraine. It's not about rooting. Yeah. It's bad, right? And again, people that act like they're not trustworthy are probably not trustworthy, and so we have to take that into account. What I wanted to ask you this, and I'll let you go. And I really super appreciate you being on and everything. It was great to talk to you. It was great to be challenged on things because that's how we all learn. But 25 years from now, if we sit down and have a beer, I'm 80. If I make it to 80, hopefully I don't. I'm pain and mad, pissed off. But how wrong are you today? How much will your position evolve over 25 years? When you look back, be like, I missed on that. Because we all think we're right. And you and I both know, because we're lifelong learners, I've evolved quite a bit from then. What do you think? It's a ridiculous question, because who the hell knows? But Um, how accurate are you today, do you think?
I wrote my dissertation and then later published an improved, hopefully, version of it, a trade press. And I now think, and to my understanding, it's about the most damning and holistic indictment of the U.S. political system that has emerged in U.S. social science that I know of. I
Yeah.
mean, it just documents how it's a totally lawless affair and so on, and that the regime is not what we think it is. Well, I've only become more grim in my assessment of it. I've only learned more terrible aspects of it since then.
There's no good news coming out of you, man.
There isn't, but I think
Oh
that
my
when
God.
what I want to say is that the good news is that I feel that it's going to become clear that we have been fed so many lies about things that we may re-examine our assessments and
Right.
try to understand how we got there and how we came to think the things that we think. And I think that when you look at how capitalism began in Europe as these guys who stole land from the people, the commons, and you had feudalism, which was a bad system, but these sort of networks of greedy people stole their people's land,
Right.
and they used it to set up these sheep farming enterprises for the first industry in Britain, which was the textile industry, and that began industrialization. But it also led to the push for imperialism because these people were pushed off the land and there were population pressures. So they start going to Ireland and they just kill everyone there and take all the land they want. And then they do the same in North America and they wipe out the Indians and they bring in slaves and they steal California and everything from Mexico. And then once we do that, we fight the Spanish-American War and these wars in Central America, Haiti, Nicaragua, the Boxer Rebellion in China. We're part of the opium trade with China, which is very brutal, and that's what finances Yale and Princeton and other Ivy League schools and rich families. And what you just see is that there were people in America trying to make it, and it was a good place for people to have an opportunity at a good life if they came here and were willing to work hard. For a lot of people, it was a land of opportunity. But there's always been this vicious imperialist oligarchy running it that if we just look back on it, it's a product of history, but it's no longer viable, I don't think. And I
Right.
think we have to look at the source of this, and just allowing a society to be organized on the basis of acquiring money and power and buying and selling everything is a fundamental flaw. And we need something closer to a socialism in that, do you allow capital to be privileged over society, or should society be privileged over capital? And I believe that human beings and society as a whole are important, and that our society is in terrible shape because we have a system that is where society is to be dominated by wealth and power. And
Yeah.
that we're going to be defeated on the international stage by people who can offer something better to the world. And that if we recognize that, it may open up possibilities, or it may make these possibilities seem inevitable because what we're doing is so obviously failing, and we can't even beat everybody up and declare ourselves the winner anymore. And that's going to take some sober reflection,
Oof.
or we're just going to blow up the world trying to save our position of power. That I worry about. But if
Oh,
not, if not, the grimness is hopeful because you have to know where you are and realistically before you really can reform yourself. And so I think that my analysis is correct, and by and large, and that it's going to be perceived as such by people, hopefully, as time goes on, and there will be reforms, because realistically you can't keep doing things that are failing. And that's what we're doing now. We are the
yeah.
United States of failure.
I love it. I love it. Well, listen, everybody, this is Aaron Good, not Mr. Aaron Good News, but Aaron Good giving us the facts. And it's hard, and we all need to hear it. And I hope you all appreciate this episode. Aaron, thank you very much for coming on, and hopefully have you back on and talk about this some more. Everybody should get the book. It's down here below. You know what I say? Get to and buddy read, and see where you're at. And if you guys have questions, let me know. I'll bring Aaron back, and we'll get some of these questions and let him explain where he's at. One of the big things about scientific method is that your job, and I think what Aaron is doing, is you challenge the established things. Yes, you can write new things. Yes, you can add on to the body of work, but he's like saying, hey, hold on a second here. Look at where we're going. Look at these things. This is not working right. And here's why I think why. That's why it's important to listen to Aaron, what he has to say. Aaron, I'll give you
Yeah.
the last word and we'll go from there.
Okay, last thing I'll add is that I'm too radical for the Academy, and so I created a podcast. It's the American Exception podcast on Patreon. So you can find me there, and I put out material pretty regularly, and we cover a lot of topics like the JFK assassination, the international drug trade, and the crime syndicate, and CIA covert operations around the world, and other topics related to the deep state from an academic perspective. So I'm not likely to bust out Illuminati, lizard people type of analysis, but I do my best to be a sober academic. So you can follow my work there. And thanks, Pete. It was good talking to you, and I appreciate the platform.
Yeah. All right, everybody. I'll see you. Actually, I'll see you on Wednesday. Aaron, I'll say goodbye to you in a second. Bye bye,
All
y'all.
right, bye.